If you've been playing any instrument for a few years now, you've probably noticed that even with your increasing comfort in the instrument, even in your best performances, the ones where you hit all the notes right on the dot, there is just something missing, something that does exist in your favorite recordings of the pieces you're playing by your favorite artists. Today, we're going to address some things that you can do to take the next step towards making your music, well, more musical. I'm Tobias Murphy, and this is Murphy Music Academy. Now, for those of you just popping in, this is in fact a violin-focused channel. However, today's video is designed to be a lot more applicable to musicians of just about any field, voice, or instrument. Now, of course, the obligatory preliminaries: if you liked the video, then like the video. If you have something burning in your heart you have to say to me, then put it down in the comments, because I'm very good at replying to those. Also, if you are a violinist or want to be and think, I should probably get some help with this, which by the way, you definitely should, then I teach a lot of people via Skype, or if you happen to live in the Southeast Michigan area of the United States, then you can come to me for live lessons. Also, believe it or not, I do have international students, so if you're watching from somewhere else in the world, so long as I can line it up with the Eastern Standard Time Zone, then we can work that out. And of course, subscribe. Now, this video is intended for those who have been actually studying music of some kind for at least a few years. If you're just coming into this and be like, I want to be a musical person, and never looked at music before, you've never studied a musical instrument before, this really isn't going to help you that much. I mean, you can just keep watching and put it on the background and boost my numbers up, but it's really not going to be much more than a novelty. If you have no experience with music and you want to become a more musical-oriented person, then go listen to Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. You know, this. Probably the first actual meme of classical music. Not just the first two bars, but the actual whole thing, all 35 minutes of it. It's actually really good. Now, the subject I want to talk about today that is going to help you take your music and make it more musical is something that, if you've been studying music for a while, I'm sure you've heard your teacher talk about, which is phrasing. And my goal today is to explain the basics of phrasing in such a way that anyone watching this video can both understand and start acting on them. Because even though it was something even my earliest teachers were mentioning, it wasn't something that I felt they were explaining quite properly enough for me to really act on it in a meaningful way. First, we have to start with, what is the actual definition of a musical phrase? Well, to quote our trusty source, Wikipedia, a phrase is a unit of musical meter that has a complete musical sense of its own. Not really the most helpful definition. And that amorphous definition can be part of the difficulty. There is some ambiguity in deciding exactly where phrases are, where they begin and where they end. And in fact, two different musicians can argue with each other on whether or not the phrase should be 4 bars in this one particular piece of music, or whether the next 4 bars, making an 8-bar phrase, is where the exact phrase is in that piece of music. And both of those musicians will then approach the music a little differently depending on where they demarcate the phrases. Now, before I go into giving exact examples of phrasing in pieces of music so you can go about finding phrases in your own music, you might be wondering, well, what is the point of dividing music into phrases? Well, music is differentiated from static art, let's say like a sculpture, in that it moves, it has direction. It moves from one point of specifically time to another point in time. If you were to observe a statue, let's say like Michelangelo's David, every single aspect of it exists at the same time. Even if it takes you a while to walk around it and observe all of the different aspects of it, all of those aspects that make up Michelangelo's David exist simultaneously. Music is not so. I cannot just pick up the sheet music here and experience it the same way I would experience Michelangelo's David as a completed whole that I can just walk around and drink in different aspects of it. I have to follow it from beginning to end, from conception to conclusion. It has a logic that follows from note to note. And that logic is where phrasing comes in for the performer, because even if all of the ideas of the music, the logic of it going from one end to the other, is inherent to the music itself, if the performer does not pay attention to that in their performing, it'd be much like reading a book where you just kind of oddly grouped words together or just focused on one word at a time, it'd be very difficult to understand. For instance, if I read the opening page of this book in such a manner as the concept of culture leapt fully, armed from the head of Johann Gottfried Herder in. Some of you play music this way. So the first thing we need to do is to learn how to accurately identify phrases in our music so we can approach them in a way that makes a logical, syntactically musical sense. Now, one of the easiest ways to start identifying phrases in your music is to, if you're playing classical or early Romantic era music especially, just count the measures. If your music is in 4/4 time, and let's be honest, most of it is probably going to be, then it actually is very natural for the composer to write out phrases that are generally 4 bars in length. Sometimes 8, but usually 4. For a clear example of this for my violin students out there, you can look at the second piece in the Suzuki Book 4, the Sights Concerto, which has a clear 4-bar phrase at the beginning. For a more mature example, you could go to the piece of music I was waving around here earlier, the Mozart's Third Violin Concerto in G major. Just like the Wikipedia definition of a phrase, both of those are complete musical ideas. They're like musical sentences. They don't tell the entire story of the music, but they are complete and self-contained. The relationship to actual language grammar is most obvious in the sights. For example, you could see this as kind of being the subject, and then this sort of being the verb that connects that to what happens next, which this would be the object. Now, of course, I do understand that not all languages have a subject, verb, object, sentence order, so it may be a little bit of a clumsy comparison for some of you, but I do think it is a good way to start learning how to conceptualize phrases and how to approach playing them. At the very least, we can understand the direction of this musical idea. It does start with something that I think cannot be explained any other way than a declaration. It then travels from that opening declaration to this specific point a few bars later. Now, of course, the beginning and the end of the phrase couldn't be possibly more different in character. The beginning is very bold and brash, and the end is much sweeter and lighter. So everything that happens in between, from beginning to end, has to make sense to lead us from one end to the other. This process of identifying these self-contained sections of music and attempting to play them at least from one end to the other in a way that makes a logical sense is what we call phrasing, and it is the first step of having a kind of mature musicality. Now, of course, once you start being able to identify and play phrases in a logical manner, you're going to want to start connecting one phrase to the next. It's like sort of a musical paragraph. For example, the next phrase in the sights is also another lovely 4-bar length, but also is kind of an answer to, you could say, the question of the original phrase. Of course, not all phrases are going to be a nice, tidy 4 bars, so you are going to need to use some musical intuition to be able to understand where phrases begin and where phrases end. For an example of a little bit more amorphous phrase length, let us look again at Book 4 to the Vivaldi A minor violin concerto. Now, you could make 2 possible arguments for where you think the phrase should or should not be. For example, you could say that this is the opening phrase. Also contain the next section that falls directly after it as part of the contained musical idea. And this is where you could get a little bit ambiguous and argue one way or the other, and you really wouldn't be wrong. Neither of these examples of the possible phrases, either the short one or the long one, is tied up in a nice bow with 4 to 8 bars. It can also be very easily argued that both have a self-contained musical idea. However, an argument in favor of the idea of the longer phrase could be that the opening 2 bars sounds something more like a proposition, not a complete idea that is then completed by the next few bars. And this is where music gets to be really fun and mentally engaging. This is where you get to have arguments with yourself and others over what is the best way to interpret the direction and purpose of the music you are playing. How to effectively communicate the emotions of the music that you are trying to communicate in a way that is not only viscerally effective, but also logical. Now, I think that is enough to help you understand how to identify basic phrases in your music. I think most of you watching this video are not going to be playing advanced music where sometimes the phrasing can be a little bit ambiguous. So I think what we've done here to help you identify phrases can be enough. Just remember, it's usually between 4 to 8 bars, not exactly, but typically will be between 4 to 8 bars, and usually has what you can hear as a musical sentence or an expressed singular musical idea that stands by itself. Now that you can locate phrases in your music, we want to revisit the idea of how to play across the phrase from one end of the phrase to the other. So, how do we as performers go about approaching the direction of a musical phrase in a proper manner? Well, first thing you want to think about is, can you make a single note musical in terms of giving the audience a sense of its beginning, middle, and end that tells something of a story? To explain a little bit further, I see someone as being a fully realized musical person when whatever they approach in their music, they're approaching with a complete sense of purpose, no matter whether it's a 50-minute long work or just a single note. So, take out your instrument, whether it's violin, clarinet, or piano, or the kazoo, and just play a single note. What can you make out of it? Now, let me show you what I would do if I were just to approach, let's say, a D natural in what I would consider a musical way. So. Now, there's not a whole lot that I can do with a contextless D natural. However, I can try to approach it as having a shape, a middle, beginning, and an end, a beginning and a direction that goes to that end that makes some kind of sense. So for me, the best way to approach just a D natural with no other instructions about it is to have sort of a nice even start, to sort of have a growth to the middle, and a nice taper at the end. But it's not the same as having just a big swell. That would sound something like this. Because there, the direction goes right to the middle, and that kind of leaves us honestly sort of directionless, because there is no logical end. This is a bit to the side of our topic today, but just write this down and at least have it somewhere in your mind when you're trying to make music, that affected swells are the most disingenuous form of music making. Random swelling is what you do when, honestly, you don't have any idea what else to do. Now back to music. Music, of course, is not going to typically consist of just a single note. You're going to need several notes strung together to create, as we mentioned earlier, a phrase, a completed musical idea. However, if you are able to approach even a single note with a sense of musical intent, it's not going to be that far of a stretch for you to then do that in the rest of your music as well. It's all about a general sense that you have when you pick up your instrument and you start to play, that you are actually approaching the music with intent. So that same beginning, middle, and end direction idea has to be approached in phrases as well as in single notes. So let's go back to our good buddy, the sights. How do we get from here to here? Well, let's talk about everyone's most favorite to ignore part of the music and also of notes, the middle. The beginning, as I said before, has a very bold sound to it, and the end is very light and sweet. So something has to happen in the middle to make a transition. So, for me, this has to have also a sense of that boldness, but it has to calm down, which the composer made easy as he made the line descend. So that is the most important part, that dee-da-dum. I can start with that kind of oomph on that first note, which I will do using bow speed. Other instruments will be able to use different things for that kind of effect, but I will do using bow speed and a light bow. So I have that sort of energy at the beginning of the note, but it also can kind of drift away at the same time. And sort of a little diminuendo there's a little taper, da da da. But I do something with the sound that sort of makes it feel like it's up in the air, so it's not going to sound like the end of the phrase. Sometimes your body motion can help with this idea. And then it begs for the next bit. And here, because I prepared the music in that way, I can then add just the most sweet, beautiful sound afterwards. Now, this is how I'm explaining what I tend to do naturally, and once you've kind of been doing music for a while and you've honestly had people talk to you in the way that I'm explaining phrases, and you absorb a lot of music by, going and listening to Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, do it if you haven't, you absorb this kind of sense of musicality anyway, but there also needs to be a bit of this type of planned thought, which even if you do something naturally, even if you have a natural sense of phrasing, you need to be able to understand what you're doing and explain it in the way that I did. Because there are going to be times when you come to a little bit more complicated music where to really understand how to take the direction, you are going to need to sort of break it down. For instance, and this doesn't really count as something I consider to be musically complicated, but a little bit more so than the sights. I was working today with someone on the Rameau Gavotte, which you will find in Suzuki Book 6, and I was working with them on making sure that the phrase they were playing had a specific type of climax, because there was a little bit of a kind of natural pulsing that would happen in the music, so it could be very easy, if you're not careful, to have what I call a very vertical phrasing, where you're just sort of emphasizing the down bows and there's not a linear sense to the phrase. Now in this music, you can get away with a little bit of that because it's kind of written to the music. There are these pulsing gestures. That kind of thing. So it goes all very smooth and open. Then that gesture, you can get away with some pulsing, some ba, ba. And here's where some little bits of what I would call unaffected swells, so things you aren't just kind of stamping on but have a purpose, can be used, because this is actually outlining, and this is where we get into a little bit of musical nerdy stuff, it's sort of theory, but it's outlining a G major arpeggio. The first note is, so it goes, but because that's not as interesting, the composer added notes right below that, but you need to emphasize the notes that form the core of the arpeggio. So he went, but however, he then, instead of going down, he goes, the notes go down, they go dee-dong, dee-dong. The last one, he actually makes it go upwards instead. So he starts on the lower note and goes up. So you have to approach that differently. Here's the one you have to approach differently. This is the one you don't want to swell on. And you want to connect it to the next note because this is the climax of the entire phrase. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. I know this video has been maybe a bit of a ramble. It's very difficult to explain an idea in under 20 minutes. I did my best, but it's very difficult to explain an idea under 20 minutes that can take an entire lifetime to understand. But hopefully I would just wanted to get you thinking, and I hope that I've done that. So until next time, find the phrases in your music, find and search out the most beautiful way and logical way that you can approach them to most effectively communicate the music to your audience. Consider this part of the journey that I am sending you down towards excellence, which I try to do every time I upload a video, because you know, as well as I, there is no pleasure in mediocrity. Happy practicing, and I'll see you next time.